Hello everyone, I'm Jennifer Hewett. I'm the National Affairs columnist for the Australian Financial Review, and I would like to welcome you to this event that's being held by the University of New South Wales Centre for Ideas at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place. That is the lands of the Bidjigal people and the lands of the BUNSWideas and the Woiwurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I know that this is going to be an extremely interesting discussion at a time that we have probably more than ever being alert to, what the future holds, what the risks are, what the opportunities are. There's certainly a lot of discussion, even virtually, going on, probably more than I can remember in quite a long time in journalism. And I guess what we want to know is whether or not those changes are going to be really major and profound, or whether in the end they're going to be more marginal. We've had a lot of talk about reform, obviously, in Australia. I'm sure there's been a lot of talk in Canada as well, and about whether or not there should be major structural reforms. The Prime Minister has recently given a very conciliatory talk on the need for industrial relations reform and getting unions and employers together. There are calls for more government assistance, but there's also calls for re-stimulating private sector investment, which was pretty low even before COVID-19 struck, and of course is very bad, looking very bad at the moment. So on this panel, I'm pleased to introduce some very well-known practitioners who are very practiced now at speaking on topics like this. So first of all, we have Joshua Gans, who's Professor of Strategic Management at the University of Toronto and Chief Economist at the aptly named Creative Destruction Lab. And he's also author of Economics in the Age of COVID, which, as you will acknowledge, is a fairly recently published book. We have Richard Holden, Professor of Economics at University of New South Wales, with a PhD from Harvard and faculty time at MIT and the University of Chicago, and a regular contributor to publications here. And we also have Judith Sloan, economist, and has had various government appointments in her very short time. Is an economist, but is also a regular contributor to publications and contributing economics editor of The Australian. So we're going to be speaking for about an hour, and we're going to take also some questions from the audience. But I would just want those ones are being resubmitted, obviously. But I guess I'd like to start with you, Joshua, because of course the big question, which presumably you've answered or tried to answer in your book, Economics in the Age of COVID. What is the key to economics in the age of COVID?
Well, the key thesis really is that pandemics are fundamentally an information problem. We think of them as a health problem, people who have a virus, they're carriers, and they go and spread it to others. But actually, it really, from the point of view of how an economist would look at it, and that is how would you manage the problem, it's an information problem. If you know who is infected and can potentially be, therefore, infectious, then the policy is very clear. You take those people and you isolate them. So the fact of us not doing that in most countries in the world, or being unable to do it because this virus is asymptomatic for 4 to 5 days, is the challenge that we have to overcome. In other words, we could deal with any of these viruses right away very effectively if we knew who was infectious. The problem we face is that we don't know who's infectious. And so that necessitates two solutions. One is, if you never find out who's infectious, you end up treating everybody as infectious and sending them all home. That is extremely costly. If you have, on the other hand, some means of being able to determine who's infectious, you do that, you implement that, people can go about their daily business except for the period of time where they're infectious, where they have to be taken out. And so that's really the fundamental thesis, and all this sort of work about doing it is that I see pandemics as an information problem.
In Australia, I think we seem to have managed the health aspect of that information problem reasonably or very well. So we're going to be having, I think, this economic concerns obviously are very great at the moment, and how we come out of this economy, out of this economic crisis. So, Richard, how do you see the Australian economy looking at the moment? What are the main problems that you think need to be addressed?
Yeah, well, I very much agree with what Joshua said about the information problem and dealing with it, and we have done very well, at least compared to countries around the world, on the public health front. The economy is obviously suffering from a supply shock. That supply shock is people not producing for reasons largely to do with the virus, but also incrementally due to the lockdown that was important in getting the public health problem under control. So we've got a situation where there's been a big contraction in economic activity. That's slowly starting to come back as the lockdown is relaxed and people are more confident that they can go about their everyday life and their ordinary business without getting infected. But what we're really running into, I think, is where once we get that back to a normal sort of supply level, we're then going to have a standard kind of recession a la, say, 2008, which is a big problem on the demand side. People are going to lack business and consumer confidence. There's going to be households trying to de-lever and rebuild their household balance sheet. People are going to be extremely cautious about making financial commitments because they've seen how overextended they can be and all of a sudden be under huge financial pressure. So I think that we've got kind of wave one of the economic response, which is things like JobKeeper and the doubling of JobSeeker. And some point either later this year or early next year, we're going to have to see wave two, which is going to look a lot more like 2008.
Judith, is that how you see it, a standard recession with wave two coming down?
Look, I think it's important to note that there are going to be, inevitable structural aspects to what eventually emerges. So that comes in two categories. One is that there were some sectors or firms within sectors that were under significant pressure prior to COVID-19. So, for example, in the retailing space, there were some of the chains and the like. In fact, some had gone broke prior to the COVID-19 problem emerging. So that will just be accelerated. So I think by and large, there are some important structural issues that will basically have been accelerated. The second one is that in many ways, I thought the idea of the snapback was probably misguided in the sense that it kind of implies we're going back to where we were. But I don't think we're going to go back to where we were. In particular, we're likely to see a probably much lower contribution of trade to the Australian economy, and particularly trade associated with the international movement of people. And so that has very significant effects both on the overall level of activity, but in terms of its sectoral impact. And I think we might get on later to the impact, for example, on higher education. Unless you can assume there will be a resumption of the international movement of people into Australia at the levels that existed prior to COVID-19, then there must be some structural pressures, possibly to shrink, I might add, on those particular sectors.
And Joshua, obviously Canada, like Australia, is a very trade-exposed country with a very strong resources sector. How do you see those pressures in the Canadian economy?
Well, I think they're different. I mean, I think they're, I wish Canada had the problems of the Australian economy, because fundamentally the problems as Judith and Richard were saying are essentially, oh, well, we've had a global massive disruption, and that's going to cause some economic pain for some period of time. But, fundamentally in Canada, we are yet to see the virus be under control. So we don't have the options of moving back to our own internal economy working well, let alone the international trade situation, which is far more fraught because of the border with the United States, which is even worse in terms of its dealing with the health problem. And these are very interconnected economies. So I kind of think about Australia and I think, well, actually, things are actually looking up. I actually think that the main trading partners of Australia, including the movement of people, are in Asia. And that is extremely comforting because there are also a set of countries who have got their arse into gear in terms of getting the health impact under control. So, I only wish we were in that same situation.
You see, Jenny, I think that's a really important point, and it's a point of division among economists. But I see the complementarity between pandemic management and good economic outcomes. Whereas there are another group of economists who think, well, we shouldn't have engaged in the lockdowns and the like and the restrictions because they were too economically damaging. And so there's some sort of, a plus and minus here. But I think the fact that Australia has been able to manage the pandemic extraordinarily well has all sorts of effects down the track. Now, I know it's frustrating at the moment that the restrictions are being only slowly lifted and some are a bit silly. But if you sort of see this over the medium term, and going back to the idea of sort of an information problem, Australia is going to have a sort of, gold medal in terms of having managed the pandemic well, and that I think will place us well in the future.
Well, that's right, Richard. Of course, it does make it a lot easier if you don't have a border, particularly with a country like the US where the virus still seems to be very much out of control. What type of opportunities do you think this offers for the Australian economy?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I agree with Judith's point about, getting the virus under control. You basically can't have a functioning economy in the middle of an out of control pandemic. So we've done very well to get that under control. That puts us in a position to recover some lost ground. So at some point, we may be able to get our international students coming back into the country. It remains to be seen at exactly what rate. But as some people have pointed out, Australia looks a lot more attractive for international students than somewhere like the UK or the US does, or perhaps even Canada at the moment. And so we seem relatively well positioned there, but there'll be this general nervousness about movement of people that may tip the balance into that being a overall negative. But that's one area of opportunity. The other areas are largely to do, I think, with human capital and movement of people. So there's been an ongoing debate about the level of immigration and the connection to infrastructure in Australia, and I think there are reasonable points that have been made about that. Australia's had very high levels of skilled immigration as a overall proportion of our intake. This is a time where we could be really turbocharging that and taking highly skilled immigrants into Australia who are looking to be in a functioning economy and get out of ones that are suffering. So I think that's another area. It's all around, what advantages are afforded to Australia by our good public health response. It's that we can pick up on international movement of people when other countries are going to struggle to do that.
And Joshua, so you said, you're still having difficulties getting the virus under control in Canada and not helped by your proximity to the US. Does that mean that talk of economic reform in Canada is really on the back burner, that nobody's really talking about that at the moment? It's just about survival?
Well, I don't think... I think some of these things were ongoing regardless I think at the moment, clearly the current crisis is the major issue. In terms of Canada is an odd place with respect to, microeconomic reform and other things that we saw in Australia. Canada is, generally more regulated. It accepts in a number of places for cultural and other reasons higher costs of doing business. It has multiple languages, which is another constraint. And it has this, tie to the US that is extremely strong. So it's never had, for instance, the lack of competition issues of quite the same dimension that Australia has had to grapple with and had to deal with. It has, by the same token, and just to flip it the other way, done relatively better in terms of being able to therefore get its infrastructure working and have infrastructure investment. And you can see that. I'll give the most noted example is simply on broadband speed and access and all of that. It isn't an issue here. There was competition. It got built out. It's not as cheap as it could be relative to, say, the European Union, but it is available, which has been extremely important at this particular time. But when it comes down to it, those issues aren't big issues of reform. There are issues of inequality, but there's so much muted relative to the issues elsewhere. The tax rates here are much higher, but that doesn't seem to be a force of grave concern. There are environmental issues. Those are being dealt with. Some would say, Canada is the last place on earth that should be worrying about the consequences of climate change, yet it's rolling out carbon tax system as we speak, and there's been no halt of that. So these sorts of things are progressing, but I don't get the sense of major reform issues in the same way. The level of economic discourse in Canada versus Australia. Australia economics is far more weightier. Canada, less so in the public mind.
I'll get back to that point with Judith in 1 second, but just while I've got you there, I'm curious, when you said broadband's been rolled out and it's been no problem, is that an all-fibre network?
No, it's not all fibre. In fact, I have to this house right now a cable network. Contrary to what I was being told by engineers 10 years ago in Australia when I was working on broadband, the cable network can sustain high speeds. We get 500 megabits measured to the home per second, which is extraordinary when you think about it. I have the option of having a fibre connection. There is one going past my home. I choose not to have it. I'm happy with my current connection, and it's also unlimited. It's completely uncapped. I can use as much as I want. That's really quite something when you think about it. I didn't need 500 megabits a second until I had 5 people living at home, everybody using computers, streaming and talking with video all at once, and no problem. No problem. So I think those are very important things. Now, as you move out into the less dense parts of Canada, there are still issues. But it's nice to, at least within the places where it should have broadband, you have broadband and you have multiple options for broadband. Okay,
well, of course, we could have an entire discussion on broadband, but I'll just leave that there for the moment. But Judith, what types of, do you think it's true that there's a kind of heavier discussion about economics in Australia? And also, what are the types of economic reforms that you think are most important and that we have a realistic opportunity of trying to get through in Australia now?
Well, on that first point, and I'd like to hear Richard's view on this. Yes, no, I think Australian media and even just the ordinary folk, are kind of really interested in economics in a way that you just don't see overseas. I'm not quite sure why that is. It's not even just sort of hip pocket nerve stuff. It's, sort of economic policy stuff, right? I mean, I personally find it fine, but I guess some people would find it extremely dreary, but there we go. Look, I think, I mean, one point we could touch on with Josh too is this issue of economic reform within a federation, because I think that is a kind of an additional challenge. And in many ways, I think the National Cabinet has been quite a good idea. Certainly in terms of the pandemic management, it's been a good idea. I mean, because let's face it, the sort of COEC process was a bit like, sort of treacle or something, and nothing ever came out of that. So, one would hope that there are elements of that cooperation through the National Cabinet process that can be retained. And you see, when you think about economic reform, so much of it actually does vest with the states and territories, right? Either in terms of formulating the reforms or executing the policies that are agreed to. So, Richard mentioned infrastructure. I mean, by and large, infrastructure spending, certainly public infrastructure spending, is undertaken by the states and territories. There might be sort of funding and regulatory interventions from the federal government, but and that is an area where I think certainly speaking as a Victorian, we've done this pretty badly, right? Both in terms of selection of projects, the length of time it takes to get to those projects, and then the execution of the projects, which are too expensive and take too long. So if we could fix that sort of stuff up, that would actually be, I think, a very good outcome. I'm not holding my breath, but I think certainly infrastructure spending is something, and not always the large stuff. I think around Melbourne, I mean, getting rid of the boom gates, which clogged up our roads because of the old rail system, has probably had huge productivity benefits compared with some of the very large projects.
Richard, what types of economic reforms are you looking for?
Well, I think that we need more than ever to increase productivity. So before this crisis, Australia had, essentially zero GDP growth per capita. So, living standards were essentially flat going into this. And we live, I think, in an age of what former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers has sort of reinvigorated the term secular stagnation, an era of kind of low growth, low inflation, where you have a huge amount of savings around the world chasing relatively few high dollar investment opportunities. And that puts more pressure on the demand side of the economy. But going with that, we need productivity reforms and a kind of second wave of those in Australia. A lot of things have been commented on by people on this panel. A lot of these things have been put off, whether it's industrial relations or other things in the economy have been kind of too hard. And of course, with the Prime Minister's speech yesterday, that sort of thing is back on the table. But we've gone from having one of the lowest tax rates, company tax rates in the OECD, to the second or third highest tax rate in the OECD. And it kind of just happened as we didn't do anything and other countries were becoming more competitive. That's a really important thing for a country that's capital thirsty like Australia. Industrial relations reform, we've done a lot in the 1980s and start of the 90s. And again, kind of nothing happened and we've kind of coasted along, and all of a sudden we find ourselves with a system that doesn't seem to be able to adapt to changing circumstances very well. So I think there's going to be an increased possibility of this kind of stuff, but also an increased need for it.
Joshua, in Canada, is it just this kind of difference of culture that people do talk about things like tax rates constantly in Australia, it seems, and industrial relations reform? Is that even happening? Are they important issues in Canada or not, or just not really significant?
It's kind of funny. My recollection was when we ever had industrial action, strikes and the like, it was a national emergency by the very nature of it. And thinking back a few months, because it's kind of hard to do so, most of this beginning of this year, the teachers in Toronto, where there's a district school board, were engaging in rolling strikes. You know, basically once every 2 weeks, there would be no school, etc., going on. And that was a source of frustration, and people wanted it to be resolved. But it didn't have the same sense of urgency or whatever, or headline making on a continual basis that I recall from Australia. In other words, there's this sort of acceptance that industrial action is just par for the course, and it's part of the process. That's at least my impression. I don't know how this would bear up in any statistics or anything like that. But Canada does manage to, have a manufacturing base. It's got one of the largest car parts manufacturers in the world, for instance, here. And it also manages to, nowadays, stimulate innovation in ways that, I spent 15 years in Australia working on innovation policy, and there'd be nothing to show for it. There'd be a Cochlear here or a CSL there or something like that, but nothing really. In comparison, here there is just an entire startup ecosystem. One of that ecosystem has in the last 10 years birthed a $120 billion value company. Was Canada's largest. In other words, Canada's most valuable company was formed less than 15 years ago out of a snowboarding business. And that's all on the basis of technology. And so if you look at your ability to be able to do that sort of thing, birth a new company that is a global competitor, Canada is able to do it in ways that Australia and frankly Europe are not. And it's quite extraordinary to see that happen. So I guess the challenge has always been, why not? Why not Australia being able to do these things? It is an attractive place to live. It's got a stable macroeconomic set of circumstances for the most part. It has a functioning public system. It has, it doesn't have ridiculously closed immigration laws that have come up anywhere else. It is far away, but who cares? I mean, we're sitting here having this conversation now. Do we really care about that stuff now? No one seems to worry about that aside from time zones. So, from that point of view, you say, what's missing? Well, I guess capital. But the capital that comes to fund this stuff comes globally. So it doesn't have to be locally sourced. It has to be open globally. So thinking about what can unlock that barrier and have people see Australia as a place that is worth doing that investment, it does seem possible to me. It is an ongoing puzzle as to why it doesn't occur.
Well, Judith, I think I should ask you the answer to that puzzle. Why not? Is there not innovation and new companies and use of technology to create new businesses here? Or do you disagree with Joshua?
Yes, I'm not sure I entirely agree with the presentation in that sense. I mean, because I think a lot of the innovation that occurs is not necessarily associated with, hip startups, So there's no doubt that when it comes to mining, for example, Australia has been extraordinarily innovative and is basically a world leader in terms of mining technology.
Canada has the same thing. Same world leading. The same stuff gets talked about. The mining companies say the same things.
Football barracker here. I think,
But that can't be it. Remember what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the company I'm talking about is Shopify. Comes from nothing to now an Amazon challenger. That's not a hip startup.
Sure, we've got Atlassian. That came from absolutely nothing to be the unicorn. I mean, I just wonder whether you actually have to go a bit more bread and butter in terms of thinking of what drives living standards and what, innovation's great and it's sexy, and I understand why academics are interested in it. But we want to sort of think about what are the conditions facing small and medium-sized enterprises, able to establish themselves and grow. I think that element of competition is quite important, and in a country that's removed in many ways from a lot of competition, that may have been an issue in the past and may still be an issue. That, of course, relative they're not quite monopolies, but protected companies are less likely to want to invest in innovation. They don't need to. So, but I mean, if we think of this in a big picture sense, and I mean, I think Richard was right. When we went into the COVID crisis, it wasn't that great. 2019 was a year of pretty sluggish GDP growth and really appalling growth in terms of productivity, both labour and multi-factor. So that was the backdrop. Now, I was in the camp. In fact, I gave a speech, I think, in early February, which now looks extraordinarily embarrassing, saying that I thought 2020 was going to be a pretty good year. And, things were going to pick up, and, there was sort of good signs with world trade and other economies. So I've had to bin that one. I deleted that document. But maybe there are some reasons, which I guess is what Richard was saying, was that we can use this pandemic and our management of the pandemic, successful management of the pandemic, is as kind of reason to look at some of the barriers to reform, barriers to productivity growth that were almost too hard to look at before. So, and I mean, I'm happy to come back to industrial relations, Jennifer. Can I just make one final point to you, Josh, is that the reason industrial action is not really an issue now is that there basically is no industrial action. And so I was on the board of the Australian Bureau of Statistics at a time when they were actually considering ditching the series that they've had for, half a century on industrial stoppages and the like, because there were too many asterisks in the publications. Basically, we've moved on from a world where people went off and took strike action, particularly unprotected strike action, which is not the same as saying that there are the barriers to, efficient and equitable outcomes at workplaces has been achieved. But, it's a kind of, and it's true around the world, Josh, that really there is very, very little industrial action going on anymore.
Look, I think that's true, Judith, and I would like to talk about industrial relations a little bit later particularly because of the Prime Minister's speech this week. But if we just go back to this idea of innovation and companies, what is true, Richard, I think, and particularly if you look at the US and obviously, just at least to some extent Canada, if you look at the top countries, companies on the ASX, they've been remarkably stable over decades. Whereas countries like the US, for example, certainly, it's just totally revolutionised. So we do seem to have, some would call it stability, other people would call it rigidity. And so that's kind of one aspect of that. And two, the other issue that kind of is coming up over and over, people are saying, oh, look, we've lost our ability to manufacture. And that is a very important part of innovation in any economy. And we basically get away to easily. So I just get your opinion on those two issues.
Yeah, on the first, I think picking up on the conversation between Joshua and Judith, I think that the venture capital industry in Australia is heavily constrained by getting those international dollars in. So I know from my 4 or 5 years in private equity in a kind of former life, getting money from, say, US foundations into Australia is extremely difficult in the following sense, which is, Yale University wants to invest in a venture fund in Australia. Yale University, like all university foundations in the US, is tax exempt. But in Australia, money gets taxed in Australia and trapped in Australia. And so for a tax exempt entity to invest in Australia in startups and venture capital. It's true of private equity and later stage development as well. It's just very challenging to do that. There are kind of ways that it gets done, but it's hard and it's clunky. And in fact, right now, it's borderline impossible with the new FIRB rules. So that's actually extremely challenging. And that's just an area where this isn't about anyone trying to, shelter money in the Cayman Islands. This is about a tax-exempt entity in a country with which we have a tax treaty being able to invest in startups or later stage stuff for that matter in Australia. So I think that would actually be a very easy thing to get done through a tax reform process. On the stuff about manufacturing, I agree. It's kind of puzzling in a way and tantalising in another. So on one hand, we have very high, wage costs in Australia. In many ways, that's an excellent and a good thing. I don't think we want to be trying to compete with countries like China on manufacturing N95 masks or things like that. That's one of the great virtues of international trade and comparative advantage. On the other hand, we haven't seemed to do what a country like Germany has done in terms of advanced manufacturing and being able to really develop that. There are some areas in which we have in Australia, but maybe not as much as we could. And this may provide an opportunity for that. And I think the other thing with the manufacturing sector is areas where supply chains are really critical, I think, will be revisited. So even something that is much cheaper to manufacture overseas, like generic drugs, I think people are going to look at this crisis and say, well, I'm not sure we want to be on the hook to another country for 99% or 100% of our insulin or other kinds of very basic medications for a lot of people. And sure, it's going to cost a bit more to make that in Australia, but maybe we do need to have security of domestic manufacturing for some things. I worry that that's going to be taken as an invitation for some kind of economic nationalism, which would be incredibly damaging to the country and incredibly inefficient. But there are certainly some areas where I think we'll have more domestic manufacturing than we've had in the past.
Well, I think, though, that if you look at, for example, supplies of PPE or of certain medicines, I mean, everybody says, oh, yes, we're going to have to concentrate on doing a bit more of that in our economies locally, so we're not so vulnerable anymore. But as you point out, Richard, it seems to be going to a broader context, though, about how much more manufacturing is good in an economy and whether, for example, Australia should have a lot more of that. And you're saying, in one sense, that you kind of that goes to economic nationalism, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
Why? Is that because it's a thing of protectionism? Is it because you don't think it works in Australia? Why?
I think one can't get around the kind of fundamental truth of comparative advantage, that countries should focus on what they're relatively good at. And, we're not relatively good at making high labour content relatively easy to manufacture products. We are never going to be relatively good compared to pick any country you like in the region at manufacturing T-shirts. And so if we ignore the basic underlying economics of comparative advantage and say this is an invitation to T-shirt manufacture, or you often hear on Talkback Radio someone talking about why do we make pegs? And why don't we make pegs in Australia anymore for our clotheslines and things like that? That's just flying in. Yeah, exactly. So that's just flying in the face of underlying basic economics, and that's what economic nationalism a la Steve Bannon does. It sort of repudiates the fundamental tectonic forces of globalisation for political ends. So I think that's dangerous. That'll just make Australia poorer as a nation if we ignore those forces. But that being said, areas where high human capital is very important, and that may be in areas of advanced manufacturing, where our strong education system can be a real help to us, combined with high-skilled immigration from overseas. I think those are areas where we could potentially do more, and I certainly don't favour some kind of winner-picking industry policy in Australia, a la the car industry or other areas. We've seen how that works out here and abroad, but that doesn't mean that there can't be smarter investments in certain areas of manufacturing that leverage what we do have a comparative advantage in and we are relatively good at.
And And Judith, does that mean, in your view, leveraging particular areas where we do have some skills or some particular advantage, does that include, do you think, government intervention as a good idea or kind of direction, or do you think it should be left, mainly to the private sector and one size fits all in terms of tax and R&D incentives, things like that?
Look, I agree, I think, essentially with Richard. I mean, it seems to me that when you think about manufacturing, it's best for us to try and leverage off what we're good at in terms of, the feeder stock, so to speak. So we should be better at food processing, for example, because we're good at producing food. But the food processing manufacturing sector has actually shrunk a lot. We should be probably better at minerals processing too, because we're good at getting the minerals out of the ground, and so we should be better at minerals processing. Obviously we've seen things like the wine industry and the like develop. I think the idea of the government picking winners is frightening. What they have to do is to create what I'd call a facilitative framework where private enterprise, private investors can kind of see where the money goes, where the money is going to be. And one of the things I know the government has identified, though, is that when it comes to sort of larger scale factories and operations and the like, our capex, our capital costs, are way out of line with international standards, right? So it's very expensive to build an operation, build a factory, whereas actually in terms of the operating costs, we're probably okay, because actually often the technology drives the operating costs, and oftentimes overseas it's quite high labour costs as well. So we've got to sort of think of what are the impediments there. So they're talking, I think, about, the approvals processes. They tend to be too long, and that therefore is very expensive. Industrial relations is probably an impediment there, and that's why they're talking about the greenfields agreements and the like. Skills, I think, are probably really important. And I mean, I'm hoping that there is more focus on vocation. I mean, of course, there's project management, that's important, but it's actually about the sort of skills that are needed to construct these big projects and the like. I mean, we've sent our children off to do cultural and gender studies at some two-bit university, not the University of New South Wales, I might add, of course, rather than, doing vocational education and training, where if you look at the figures, I mean, a young person so inclined is much more likely to have a full-time job at the age of 25 if they've done vocational education and training compared with going to the university. So I think, there has to be some rethinking of vocational education and training in terms of how it's funded, how it's provided, the quality. But I see some quite positive upside in that area.
Well, I'll come back to education, just the general thing of education and skills. I just want to ask Josh, though, in terms of your experience both in Australia and in Canada, how do you see the difference in terms of a government either encouraging or particular sectors and having kind of a more of a directed approach as opposed to just let the framework be there for just a kind of a lower, more efficient, reasonably low tax system. In terms of that innovation and businesses that we were talking about before and manufacturing.
Oh no! Let's be very clear. Governments around the world don't seem to be able to stop themselves picking something and trying to push it, and then getting photographed in front of it. So that's a universal truth. I think we have to accept, as part of a democracy, you have politicians pushing big projects in various places, trying to do that. The disappointment that I often have with that approach, given that I see it as inevitable, and I think that is as true in Canada as it is of Australia, is the aspiration is not to do something of global significance. Judith mentioned before is, well, we don't, Australia's done just fine with the innovation that it's had. And that's absolutely 100% true. When I 25 years returned to Australia from doing my PhD, came back and sort of said, innovation, it's the way, we need innovation. And people would say, yes, if we don't have innovation, and get that going in the next 10 years, we're toast. And, after 25 years of sort of saying that message and then looking at Australia's, stellar economic performance, you have to basically revise your hypothesis. Australia does not need innovation in order to sustain its high level of standard of living. It could comfortably do all of the things that are suggested there. And the same is true of Canada as well. But there is also this sense of being able to have your mark in terms of what you contribute to the world and what is famous that way. And so I kind of think of the efforts involved in trying to push something that is unique and new and big and bold come from being part of that world community. The United States, for all its other faults, does this in spades. It has plenty of options like that. And a lot of them are also not on the back of having to be frustrated about the government this, the government that. All of those top Silicon Valley type entrepreneurs who now dominate the stage were not sitting there spending all their time railing at what government should or should not do. They largely ignored it. And I think this is, this is the sort of attitude that you need. So if governments are going to do these big projects and push them, we need to push them harder. I think, it's all very well. It's not a good idea to pick winners if you don't pick winners. But actually, if you manage to pick winners, at least aspire to doing so, then that's something different. A few years ago, I was sitting on a panel, Canada. What could Canada do that would be exciting, to push in this direction, given they were going to do it? And, said to ourselves, well, what's Canada good at? Mining. Where's the best frontier in mining? I'm going to throw this out there, and you're going to be surprised. The moon. The next frontier in mining is working out how to mine on the moon. And I thought to myself, what a great project that Australia and Canada could do together to be pushing for that, to use mining expertise to work out how to crack that problem. To be sure, it's, surely doesn't look good economically in terms of risk reward. But if you're pissing the money away anyway, it looks great. So I kind of see
at the moon. Is that what we're talking about?
Mining in the moon. Yes, we're talking about mining in the moon. Look, I was at, a few years ago, it's 2020 now. I was at this thing called the 2020 Summit. Judith, you were there, I think, as well. You're probably in the same room. And people were saying, well, what should we do there? And I said we should put an Australian on Mars, is what I said at that point. And then they said, how are we going to do that? That's too expensive. I said, well, we didn't have to bring the Australian back. But, that'll be much cheaper. Nonetheless, it's really those sorts of things that sort of like the country remembers. That's why you bring Atlassian to mind. But no one in the world brings that to mind. But in Australia, of course, because we try to pick whatever we've got that's the current best fruit. But I think, there is a potential for more. And so I'd rather than economists whining about picking winners here, picking winners there, except the politicians have this need to do so. And let's feed them the right stuff. Let's feed them, don't give them ice cream, give them vegetables so that they can grow.
Well,
yeah, look, I think that's a reasonable point, isn't it? So if you accept in the second best world they are going to pick winners, let's guide them to, there's a sort of distribution there between activities that will be losers, actually. Governments are very good at picking losers rather than winners. But is there something we can do as sort of policy advisors to direct them in to the kind of better areas? People laugh about, and to a degree I guess it's true, about corporatist cronyism France. But of course the French government picked nuclear power. And, that proved to be an incredible winner for that country because they're able to export nuclear power right through Europe and make a lot of money. Now, there's a bit of a crossroads now because they don't know whether they want to keep going with that. But that is a clear case of a government picking a winner.
Okay. Well, now we come back to what the Australian government is on about as immediately, though, whether it's not nuclear power sometime in the future, not people mining on the moon, but right now what they're particularly concerned about is jobs, jobs and jobs. Well, how do you see the outlook for jobs at the moment? Are we going to have to live with a much higher level of unemployment indefinitely? And what are the jobs most? We obviously lost a lot of jobs, in the hospitality sector, in the entertainment sector, but there's all sorts of other concerns about jobs in other areas. And how is this going to be addressed?
Yeah, it's an incredibly pressing question, and we know from past recessions, although this one, might be different, it's unlikely to be better, that unemployment spikes but takes a long time to come back down. And so we will be stuck with it. I certainly hope not indefinitely, but it'll be a long road back. And I think what it's also going to do is accelerate the decline of certain areas, whether that's certain businesses in sectors that will continue to do well or certain sectors that might be in decline. We're going to see people, businesses just not come back from this. And the workers that are attached to those businesses, need to look for new work, and it's going to be hard to find in many instances. So finding, I think the general finding meaningful work for everyone who's able to perform it was already a huge ingoing challenge. The twin pressures of globalisation and automation, while certainly on the automation side, not quite as pressing in Australia as in places like the US, they were just continuing to press on employment prospects in Australia, and it'll be, very important going forward. I think what was announced by the Prime Minister this week in terms of trying to get to a better bargain between unions and business is an important and an admirable goal, and I guess we'll see how that pans out. But getting rid of some of these frictions and allowing businesses to grow and employ more workers and pay workers more and in a way that's flexible for both sides is incredibly important. So I really see it as the pressures that were already there in terms of unemployment are going to be just sort of magnified by this, and it's going to make reform efforts all the more important.
Judith, do you think in terms of jobs, what should the focus be? And is it about getting the skills that we talked about? I know that Australia loves to talk about our fabulous education system, and with no offence to the University of New South Wales, I think in many ways that's been an illusion, and that quality has gone down in a lot of our educational institutions, both in terms of vocational education and higher education, not to mention schools. So again, is that the issue that should be being addressed more?
Well, I think so, because, clearly human capital will underpin a recovery, and I think we have been very inclined to pat ourselves on the back, haven't we? That we look, for example, at the inputs in terms of spending on these things, but are much less discerning about the output. So I think that is an issue. I just feel that, that this may be a kind of good place to start in terms of there are pressures on higher education. My guess is higher education will tend to focus more, so that's not a bad thing. And hopefully maybe even the schools might tend to focus. I think we kind of kid ourselves that the hard skills, the maths, the physics, the chemistry, clear expression of writing, for example, are not important. I try not to follow the fads in education too much because it's too depressing. But, I'm very much in the building blocks kind of person. And, you think of the four of us sitting here. What we learned as undergraduates is kind of slightly irrelevant, really. But hopefully it did. Oh, come on, Joshua.
I did economics. It's not true I've used anything else.
To continue our education effectively, because with those building blocks, you become a sort of self-education machine, don't you really? And, I think, most people should be in that position because it's the way you remain. I mean, I think, some of those figures about how many occupations our young people will have and stuff are probably a bit overwrought, really, in their predictions. But flexibility is definitely the key. Just on the, a little suspicious of Morrison's top-down kind of, talk fest idea. What's it, 5 topics or something, and we'll all, the sort of kumbaya approach to economic reform. And, you might ask yourself why the unions have got this special role when they represent, less than 10% of the private sector workforce. I mean, who are they actually representing, right? But I guess, the cynic in me tells me this, that the government thinks that there are some key choke points, probably not that many. And this is a process which will kind of resolve those choke points in a way that, they can throw a bone to the other side, so to speak. So the choke points are particularly in relation to the greenfields projects, which I talked about, the resolution of this issue with casual employment and how that we need some certainty in how that status is defined, and the premium that's attached to casual employment must be at the expense of paying other entitlements. So, I think those are the kinds of things the government finds actually difficult to resolve, and you resolve this in a broader context by, give and take. And maybe, I'm being excessively cynical, and this is the way forward to try and resolve, I think, some important issues when the labour market does start to recover.
Well, we could talk about industrial relations at length. However, to my horror, we don't have that much time left. And then one other issue that I wanted to cover before we left was you mentioned earlier, Josh, climate change. Obviously, early 2020, particularly in Australia with the bushfires, everybody wanted to talk about climate change. That's kind of gone on the back burner again because of COVID-19. Do you see that, and the whole question of ESG investing, for example, environmental, social and governance, do you see that kind of coming back in the same way once this particular pandemic is somewhat more under control?
I think there's an opportunity. I think the pandemic, because it's a catastrophe, will give us an opportunity to push climate change further. Climate change and the pandemic are very similar. They're not observable to people, but we're told that they exist because of the data, and we have to react to them because the consequences, because we want to find ourselves in the situation where we've done something about it rather than had the problems of not having done something about it. So they're very similar in that way. I think that experience, less so in Australia than elsewhere, having a few months of doing without gets you to think about your need for material goods and travel and other things like that quite extensively. That's an opportunity. So I think there are some means by which that could occur. That said, no one's going to be jumping up and down to do stuff about climate change when there's a global depression. So we have that challenge ahead. But again, I'm going to remain just cautiously optimistic that there'll be some sort of inspirational leader who managed to use this crisis to push this along.
Richard.
Yeah, I agree with Joshua that at a time of recession and economic contraction, doing something that is economically costly, at least in the short term, is going to be challenging. I do think that we're going to have to continue to sort of have the debate in Australia about the importance of some kind of price on carbon, in addition to whatever other measures are taken. So it's fine to have some sort of view about technology and the so-called technology roadmap, but the way you get people to invest in that technology and to adopt that technology, be it businesses or eventually consumers, is you level the playing field through having a price on that. Now, my preferred approach to this, and Rosalind Dixon and I have been plugging this in the Australian context for a couple of years now, is the Australian Carbon Dividend Plan. It's to have a $50 a tonne tax on carbon at the point source and give that back 100%, every dollar of it evenly to every voting age Australian citizen. That'll leave about 3/4 of people better off. But I think we can't have a continued kind of slide into tinkering at the margins about this, just as the COVID crisis required, really bold action that people thought, wow, can't imagine that there's going to be a Conservative government spending $200 billion on fiscal measures. I can't believe that we're going to have a Conservative government, locking people in their homes to some degree or another. It's a reminder that when there's a big crisis, it requires serious and in many ways bold action.
Judith, I suspect you may disagree with Richard on some of those points, but this will be almost the last word for you.
Yeah, no, I think I see the world entirely differently. I mean, I think, first of all, as time has gone by, the so-called experts have turned out to be a rabble, right? So they made sort of over-the-top estimates. They disagreed with each other. So I think the left were just initially joyful of, look, we're following the experts. But it turned out, the experts have, pick your model, pick your data. And I think in the end, particularly interestingly enough in Australia with this issue of interstate borders being closed, that I think has really diminished the status of some of the so-called experts and the divisions within the experts. The other thing, of course, with the pandemic, it's been the absolute reverse. It's not about global cooperation. It's every man for themselves, every person for themselves. So, we've seen the state borders closed off. We've actually seen restrictions of movement within states. So it's kind of the opposite of climate change, where we need international cooperation. Bugger international cooperation. It was actually a very inward-looking response. We're not going to get a carbon tax, Richard. Read my lips, right? The Labor Party doesn't agree with it. The government is not going to go with it. So we've got to think there'll have to be something else. It's clear that the government wants gas, natural gas. Natural gas is their preferred transition fuel, and, expect to hear a lot about that in the coming months.
Okay, well, typically, of course, for the UNSW Centre for Ideas, there's been a lot of ideas in this discussion, and many of them we've been unable to develop quite as fully as I'd hoped. It's amazing how quickly and how it goes. But thank you very much for your time to all of the panellists, Josh and in Canada particularly, staying up. And I'm looking forward to having more events like this at UNSW and the Centre for Ideas. So thanks again for your time.
It's a pleasure, Jenny.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.